Before we move on to the last major topics of how to play by ear, I was looking back at what I had already done and realized that I needed to put more emphasis on a couple of items and add a couple items. I showed you what a quarter note was and a half note and a dotted half note and a whole note and how to count them. These are the ones that are considerably more obscure, but I showed you an eighth note, which is this, which gets 1/2 of one beat, or there's two of them for each beat. I only have one here. This is the rest for an eighth note. So it gets essentially a half of a beat, or that there are two of them, if they were side by side, would equal a quarter note, which would be one beat. I showed you an eighth note. This is a 16th note, and the only difference is that the eighth note has one flag, the 16th note has two flags, and it only gets 1/4 of one beat. So if you were playing a ballad and the beat was 1, 2, 3, 4, you would be doing 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Hopefully you'll never encounter many of these, because if you do, all you can probably do is find somebody a friend who plays the piano and can help you figure out how to count that. The other way to do it is to listen to the music and sort of memorize the beat of it and the rhythm of the notes. And that way you can deal with these kind. I don't know any other way to do it. This one escapes me. This is called a dotted quarter note. I think it means 1.5 beats, but I'm not going to guarantee that. So if you run into one of those, again, the easiest, best way, you're dealing with a piece of sheet music, which I'm going to go into in great detail in these sessions. And so if you can find somebody singing it or somebody playing it, listen to it, and figure out what this is by essentially memorizing the rhythm of all the notes. It's not that difficult. I mean, all you have to do is listen, and if you listen often enough, you'll finally have it nailed down. And I wanted to clear all that up because it was not emphasized enough the last time. If you skip the sessions on reading the treble clef and the symbols of the treble clef, which those are some of the symbols, because you already knew how to read music, that's okay, that's not a problem. But I don't think that anybody, or not many of you, can safely try to skip the sessions on chords. And that's basically where we're at. Based on the prior sessions, or based on your knowledge of music, here's what you should know by now. Number one, you know what key to hit on the piano that corresponds to every printed note on the treble clef of sheet music, and you know what they are called, and that's not too difficult since it's just A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then you have the sharps and flats. You are working to play and properly finger every major scale with both hands simultaneously. You should know how to count 4/4 time and 3/4 time, which is waltz time, and that you may have to use the next two items to find the exact beat of the first note of any song. In other words, does it fall on the first beat of a measure, the second beat of a measure, third beat of a measure, or fourth? Well, if it's waltz time, there's only 3 beats in the measure. So you know what measures are. You should have learned that from the prior sessions. And you know how to count them. You know what whole notes are and half notes, quarter notes, eighth notes, and heaven forbid, 16th notes, what they look like and how to count them, except maybe the 16th note and the dotted quarter note and possibly even the eighth note. But you can handle all the other ones. You know what a sharp is and what a flat is. You know what the symbols are, what they look like. You know what they mean when they're at the very beginning of a song, which they essentially tell you what key you're in, and they control the song throughout. And then what they mean within a song, where you've already started the song and you come to a sharp, that means you simply go up a half step. Or if it's a flat, you go down a half step. You know what a natural symbol looks like, and what it does. It turns what was a sharp into a natural tone. I don't have a sample I could show you, so I showed it to you. I drew one for the last session. And you know what rests look like, and what they're for, and how to count them. So, what do you have? What you have, believe it or not, is everything you need to start reading the melody of any song that you want to learn, one note at a time. And there's only a few basic tools left for you to learn to start playing by ear and start creating your own music. One of them is very easy. The other will take a little effort. So we'll start with the easy one. Where do you find the simple sheet music that only requires your knowledge of the treble clef? What sources are there? I showed you one source in an earlier session, and that was a regular piece of sheet music, which we'll probably see some more of, with the bass clef at the bottom and the piano treble clef above it. So those two bottom clefs or staffs were the full piano playing. But then there was a third staff above it that had the single note melody. That is one source of the kind of simple music that you will need to use. The problem with it is that you have to essentially buy them one sheet at a time, one song at a time, and it can get rather expensive. The second source are what I'll call songbooks. And I copied the cover of one that I have. Oh, incidentally, I had said much earlier in the program that I was not into electronics. I'm a Luddite. I did manage to come up with what I now consider the perfect pointer. In the last sessions, I was using an antenna, unfortunately had a magnet in it, which constantly was grabbing this screw down here. And I've come up with one of the oldest tools in the human experience. It is a chopstick. It probably goes back to, 4,000 years in China. And it's perfect for me because it is so incredibly old. The other nice thing about it is a chopstick, of course, has a musical inference to it. Some of you may know how to play chopsticks, and I may ask you to practice it sometime. In any event, this is the cover of what I will call a legal songbook. It really has 1,001 songs in it. It's mind-boggling. They're roughly this thick, and there's 2 to 3 songs on every page. This one, whenever I got it, was $15. It's probably a lot more than that. In any event, that's That's the cover of a songbook. Every single song in there, in this book, consists of a treble clef showing the melody one note at a time, and above that treble clef are the chord symbols, which is the last thing we have to deal with of the things that remain. So this is a huge source of exactly the kind of music that you should already be able to read the melody line, and the only thing left for you to learn is the chords, which again I will get to later. This is a page from that book, and it just lists, I mean, this is one of many, many, many pages of songs. These are all P, these are R, then S starts here. I mean, I forget how many S's there are, but this is a whole gob of them. The little dots that you might be able to see, and I don't know if you can see them, are the songs in here that I like to play and that I learned to play, some of them from using that book. Oh, there are 96 songs alone that start with the letter S. So when the cover says 1001 songs, they're really not kidding. So aside from the sheet music that you can buy one song at a time, that's the second source. The third source, oh, this is a sample page from that. And as I said, it does exactly what I said it did. This top song, unfortunately, is written in E flat because there's 3 flats at the beginning, and it has no lyrics. So you're never going to listen to somebody singing this song. This one is written in the key of B flat because there's 2 flats at the beginning, and it has lyrics. So if you've heard the song and been able to find a recording of it, it'll help you if this was a very complicated song. It's not, because it's almost entirely quarter notes and eighth notes. That's eighth notes. These are quarter notes. And as I said, this is the entire melody of the entire song, one note at a time. And these are the chords and where they go in relation to the lyrics, like E flat. This is E flat, this is a C seventh, C minor seventh. And don't freak out because it's going to get easier when it's all done. And this is a third example. Again, the melody is one note at a time on the treble clef. So far I've kept all my promises about reading the treble clef. Now, this next source, these are called fake books. And they're essentially identical to the song books. This is what every jazz musician I ever knew had 3 or 4 of these. And there's over 1,000 songs in each one. The problem is that they're illegal because to avoid paying royalties, the publishers have avoided the copyright laws and have simply written the music down and put it in the form that it's in that book. As a lawyer and as a former judge, it would not be appropriate for me or anyone else to own these kinds of books. But the truth is, there's a huge variety of these kind of fake books. There's probably hundreds of them around, different varieties. and probably hundreds of thousands of them in circulation. The format is identical to the legal one that I showed you earlier, the songbook. I got this cover from a friend who has this fake book, and all I did was borrow so I could copy the cover. And 2 pages of the index. The first page is dedicated only to partial scores of Broadway musicals and movies. And that's how broad these things are. I mean, they cover a tremendous amount of ground. And that is just this page and the top of this page. The bottom of this page is the full index to every song in there, in that book. And the A's go from here to here, the B's go from here to here, and it just goes on and on and on. So the amount of music that's in those is huge, and it's the same format of the treble clef, single note, melody, and then the chord symbols, just like the songbook. Here's another one that I borrowed from the same friend, and it shows the cover. And now this is actual size. So if you need portability, you buy this size fake book. It says 5th edition. Now, that's why I say there's so many of these around, it's beyond belief. And here is the index page, just the very first index page. And you can see how many songs are in it. And there's, I am reasonably sure, over 1,001 songs in that one. But it is extremely small. And that finally gets us to the last tools. Now, not only do you know how to read a memory off the treble, the melody off of a treble clef, but now you have a source for tons and tons and tons of music, and you don't have to buy an illegal fake book. You can get all of it out of songbooks that have complied with the copyright laws. So we're at the point now, and this is extremely crucial, and it's why I said at the beginning that I don't think anybody can skip this unless they already know how to do it. And if they already know how to read music and they already know how to read chord symbols, I'm not even sure why they're watching this program, because they already know how to do everything that I can show anybody. Now, the biggest difference between chords and melody is that melody is always one note at a time. Chords inherently are almost always 3 or 4, and sometimes 5, and rarely 2 notes played at the same time, which sounds like I haven't been honest with you about learning and playing one note at a time. But the fact is that all the chords that we're going to deal with you will be able to learn them one note at a time. You don't have to play them all at once, but you can look on the paper, the sheet music, and let the treble clef, because all the chords are written in the symbols are in the treble clef, and you can see where the top note perhaps is G, the middle note is E, and the lowest note is C. That's a C major chord. And so when you learn it, you are doing it one note at a time. The only difference between that and the melody is that when you play the chord, you play all three at once. And that really is the only difference. You are still learning one note at a time. I'm familiar with two kinds of chord books. Actually, there may be dozens of kinds. The one that I do not recommend this is a sample, and it says Piano Chord Book. Now, at the beginning, the first few pages, there's some handy tips on how to do this and how to do that, and I went through them all, and I think I've already told you almost everything that's in those tips. But this is the format in this book, and this is the actual size of it. This is the front cover, this is the back cover. There's 480 essential chords. The problem with them is here's a sample page. And what they're trying to tell you to do is to learn these chords. To learn a C major chord, you hit the dark keys. This would be your left hand. This would be your right hand. This is C, E, G, then you got A, B, and then again C, E, G. It's a nice thing about a piano, it just keeps repeating itself over and over and over again. The one thing that's in this book that is not in my favorite book are what they call inversions. But you don't need to see it presented this way. All you're doing is you take the C here of the C, E, G, that's the basic C major chord, and you move that C up to here, and you end up with E, G, C. Same exact chord, but it's a different inversion. Then you can also put G on the bottom, and then C and E. That would be the second inversion. Anytime you have a three-note chord, there'll be the basic major chord, and there'll be two inversions available. But you don't need to read that. All you have to do is look at this and say, all I need to do is move the C up to here and play E, G, C with my left hand. That's the only value of showing inversions. Don't worry about augmented or augmented here. So a lot of this book is wasted just because it includes all these inversions. Because you don't need a book to do an inversion. If it's a four-note chord, then there'll be the major chord plus there'll be three inversions. Just as there's two inversions with a three-note chord, there's three inversions with a four-note chord. Ooh. So that's not the biggest problem, though. The biggest problem is that because you learned the scales and you've learned enough to read the treble clef, the problem with this kind of chord book is that it completely ignores the treble clef. It completely ignores sheet music. It asks you to read this, C major, and then remember these dark keys. If you have it on sheet music, instead of these dark keys, you already have the knowledge you need to play those notes. And bypassing the treble clef is a terrible mistake, in my judgment. I mean, you can buy that book if you want, or something close to it, but I think you're far better off with my favorite, and the problem with this is my favorite, I've lost it in the course of trying to prepare for this rather lengthy program and moving from my house to the studio, back to my house and back to the studio. Somewhere my favorite chord book disappeared. Fortunately, I made copies of a couple of pages. I cut out the ones that I needed, excuse me, and so I can show you what you should look for and find. And I've lost my pointer. Oh, there it is. Now, before you freak out again, there are a grand total of 32 chords that you must learn, okay? And you'll have to memorize them. But you already know the treble clef, so you know that this CM means C major. I'll explain 6 and 7 and so on shortly. Well, let's just deal with the C major. You know how to read the treble clef. This is a treble clef. They don't mark it. And you see C, E, and G. The same 3 notes that were in that other chord book, but it doesn't show it on musical script. So when you pick this up and you're going to memorize the C major chord, you do it with your left hand. If you use your left hand, these are the fingers and thumb that you use on the left side. If you're playing it with your right hand, which is less common because chords generally are the left hand, melody is generally the right hand. But these are the fingers and thumb that you would use if you're using your right hand to play these 3 notes. I have this blown up later so that it'll be a lot clearer to you, or at least somewhat clearer. So this is the format of the entire book. The ones that have stars and check marks those are the only ones on that page that you need to learn. There is a second page, and it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. There's 10 on this page. So there's 22 on the first page and 10 on this page. That is all the chords that you will need to learn before this program is over. And it doesn't have to be done before the program is over. It can be done over the next months. Nobody's going to schedule a test or a lesson every week or anything else. The harder you work at it, the more you work at it, the sooner you'll know how to do it. But so when you see a piece of the simplified sheet music and it says above the first note of melody, which is on the treble clef, it has this symbol. That means C major. And you know that C major are these 3 notes. Now, to try to put your mind at ease, I took these 2 sheets and using digital enhancement, because it used to be digits were these things. And so I have digitally enhanced these copies. and I essentially have blacked out everything on those two sheets that you don't need to learn. And look what's left. That's it. And until you have reached a point of considerable confidence, maybe several years down the road, where you want to try to play in other keys, these 32 chords will take you through 95% of all of the songs in all the chord books I've shown you. Thousands of songs. Just these 32 chords. But you're going to be playing in the key of C, which makes perfect sense because it's by far the easiest key to play in. There's no black keys to hit. That's what makes it so nice. So that's why I did this, was to make it, let you see how little there was that you have to learn. Now, if you'll remember back to this page, which probably, if you don't know anything about music when you started, is the single most important page for you to look at, because it shows you the keys of the piano drawn to scale. This is exactly the same size like I showed you in an earlier session. And down here, it shows you the corresponding note on the treble clef. Middle C, which is this note, the white one, is one line below the 5 lines of the treble clef. D is the bottom space, so to speak. There's nothing below it except the imaginary line. E is the bottom line of the treble clef. F is the bottom space. G is the second line up. A is the second space up. B is the third line up. And the high C is the second space from the top. And this is absolutely essential, because that's the only way you have access to the thousands of songs that are in these songbooks, is you have to be able to look at this on a sheet of music, even the simple version, find this single note and know that you have to hit this key, which is, you know, the pattern here is two black, 3 black, 2 black, 3 black, 2 black. It's then the same thing going downhill. So at the same time that I showed you this, I talked about half steps and whole steps. And if you'll recall, a half step is the next key immediately adjacent to it. So if you go from C to C sharp, or call it D flat if you want, you're going a half step. If you go from C to D, you're going a whole step. If you're going from B to C or from E to F, even though they're both white keys, it's still just a half step. So you're going to learn several major chords of the 32 chords you need to learn. But the major chords are also the foundation for a tremendous number of other chords. And like I showed you a C6. This is a blown up version. Here's the C6, C7. The C6 simply is a C major chord, C, E, and G, plus the 6th note of the C major scale, which is C, D, E, F, G, A. So it's a 4-note chord consisting of C, E, G, and A. And that's what a sixth is, just by way of example. Sevenths are a little more complicated, and I'll explain them in just a second. In any event, every major chord, and it doesn't matter if you start on C, or if you start on F sharp, or A, or D, or any note. If you want to know the major chord, you already know the scale because you've read it and you've practiced it. And you can play scales with both hands. So, since you know the scale, here is the pattern of every major chord, no matter what key you're playing in. What we use C major as a simple example. C to D is a whole step. D to E is a whole step. E to F is a half step. F to G is a whole step. G to A is a whole step. A to B is a whole step. And B to C is a half step. Every major chord, regardless of where you start, will start out with the basic tonic, C in this case, and you jump 2 whole steps, and that gets you to the second note of that major chord. Then you go a half step and a whole step, and that gets you to the third note of that major chord. And that's it. That's the basic major chord in C. If you want to prove that, let's do F sharp. You start with F sharp, and you do 2 whole steps, and now you're at A sharp. That's the second note of the F sharp major chord. Then you go a half step and a whole step, and there's the third note of the F sharp major chord. F sharp, A sharp, C sharp. And that pattern, if you ever get confused, all you have to do is remember that these things are absolutely consistent, and it doesn't matter what key you're in. So an E6th chord, I'll walk you through that. E is a tough key to play in. But the E major chord is, let's see, that's a whole step and a whole step, and that gets you to the second note of the E major chord. You got E, G sharp, and then you go a whole step and a half step, that gets you to B. So that's the basic E major chord, E, A sharp, and B. But now you're going to add a sixth. So what's the sixth note of the E major scale? Well, it happens to be C sharp. So an E major sixth chord is E, G sharp, B, and C sharp. And it doesn't matter, like I said, where you start. It always comes out the same. And that was why I taught you or told you about half steps and whole steps earlier. And that same pattern applies to all the 6 chords. Sixth with a TH on the end. Now the next one, and this is tougher. Here's a major blow up that I promised. Here's where it shows the fingering, and even now it's hard to read, but what it says is 5, 3, 1. That means pinky, middle finger, thumb. This is exactly the opposite. You're playing this chord with your right hand. Your pinky would hit the G, your middle finger would hit the E, and your thumb would hit the 1. And then they also show you how to do a C6th, which I just explained What that is was C, E, G, and A, which is the basic pattern of all 6 chords. Now we get to C7th, and that's the only, I guess you'd call it an anomaly. And it applies to all 7th chords. And logically, you would say to yourself, well, if a C6 is a C major chord plus the 6th note of the C major scale, then a 7th chord would be a C major chord plus the 7th note of the C major scale. Unfortunately, that is not the case. If this is designated a C7th, and this is what C7 means, over here you'll see C major 7, which I'm going to explain shortly. What a C7th means is the 1st, the 3rd, and the 5th notes of the C major scale, that's your basic C major chord, and the 7th note of the C major scale flatted. And that's what makes it weird. So it isn't C, E, G, B, it's C, E, G, B flat. And that's true of every single chord that's designated with just C7. You must flat the 7th note of the major scale, whatever chord you're playing, whatever key you're playing a chord in. If it's a D7th, it's the same thing. You have to flat the 7th note of the D scale. Now here is a C major 7th, and that is more logical. Because a C major 7th, and I didn't come up with these names, these were made up centuries ago, and blame the authors. But the C major 7th is exactly the logical chord that you would think it was. It's the 1st note of the C major scale, the 3rd note, the 5th note, and finally the 7th note, the true 7th note of the C major scale, which is B. So a C major scale is logical. It's C, E, G, B. But a C 7th scale is not logical. It's C, E, G, and then the 7th note flatted. And that's all I can do is tell you that that's just the way it is, and you have to live with it. But when you're reading music out of these songbooks, all you're going to see down here is one note at a time, the melody. What you're going to see up here are these symbols: C major, C6th, C7th, C major 7th. Then these are all based on the G scale, and that's a G major, a G6th, a G7th, and a G major 7th. If you recall the G major scale, the next to the last note, the 7th, is actually F sharp. And that's why the G major 7th chord is G, B, D, and F sharp. But the G 7th chord is G, B, D, and the 7th note of the scale is flatted so that it's a natural F instead of the true 7th note of the G major scale, which is F sharp. So, I don't know how I can impress that anymore, but that's why these things are so crucial, because while you're playing the melody, and this is at the beginning, you'll be playing the melody one note at a time with your right hand. You will have memorized what notes to hit from these chord symbols and the treble clef that shows it on paper, and you know what to hit on the keyboard. And that's all you're going to be reading is the simple melody and these guys. And this will be your left hand. This will be your right hand. Down here are 4 G chords that you have to learn. And I did not go beyond blowing up anymore because I figured that's enough that you know how the system works. There's a bunch of D chords. I suppose I could try to find that sheet. This is this. These are the C chords. These are chords that are based on the F scale. These are chords based on the G scale. This is a D seventh, an A seventh. Now remember, you flat the seventh for any of these. E seventh. And that brings us to this. And you see, that's a capital M. That's major, just like this is C major. This is C major seventh. I'm going to have to look at my worksheet here. What you see here is a C, what you initially would say is a C major seventh, but it's not a capital M, it's a little m. And that means minor. And I did promise you that you were not going to have to learn minor scales, and you don't have to learn minor scales, but you have to learn one thing. Since everything is based on the major chord, starts out as a C major chord. This happens to be a C minor seventh, and since it is written that way, that means it's the kind of seventh that you flat. You flat the true seventh note of the C scale. But when you see a small m on the C scale, and it says C minor seventh, that means you always flat the third note of the scale. So instead of being C, E, G, B flat, which is the seventh flatted, it's C, E flat, G. And that's what minor means. And so it's identical to a major scale. It's identical to a major chord, except you flat, whenever you see the little m, you flat the third note of that scale. And in this case, in the C major scale, the third note is an E, and you flat it. And then you end up going from a C major seventh to a C minor seventh. And that's what the little m means, is minor. You have exactly the same thing in the G scale. This is a G minor sixth. That means because it's a little m, you flat the third note of the G major scale. This is a G minor seventh, which is identical to this, except it's in the key of G, and it means that you flat the third note of the G scale, the G major scale. So that's what's on the first page. Here you have some more D chords based on the key, the D major. And that is the D minor with the flatted third note of the D scale. If it was a D major, which I didn't ask you to learn, I don't think. No. The only other D is a D seventh, and it's based on the D major scale. But this one is D minor, so you flat the third note of the D major scale. This is a D minor sixth, so you flat the third note of the D major scale. These are A minor chords: E minor, E minor, F minor, F minor. This one you won't use very often, and this one you won't use very often, but I've run into them enough that I included them. They are the least common of all the chords you'll need and to play thousands of songs. But you might need them, and so I included them in the 32. These two to illustrate why transposing is the last step in this madness of playing by ear, is to get you into the key of C, because how incredibly simple it is. And this is what I want you to look at. We're back to the 2 pages of my former chord book. I want you to look how simple these chords are. C, E, G, C, E, G, A, C, E, G, B flat, C, E, G, B, F, A, C, F, A, C, D, F, A, C, E flat, F, A, C, E. Those are all the kind of chords that you're going to be playing. Those are the ones you have to learn more than any others. But check marks and stars. Now, if I was trying to teach music lessons, you'd be playing in all kinds of keys. So let's take the keys at the bottom here. I'm looking for one of my favorites. Here's some of my favorites. Here's an F sharp minor 7th. Here's an F sharp minor 6th with a 9th added. That means that you play the whole scale and then you go one more note. You start repeating that scale and you get to the 9th note. It's not part of the initial scale because the initial scale is just 8 notes from beginning to end. A 9th is an additional note that's above that scale, and it happens to be 1 note above the tonic. Here's a 13th. That means you got to spread your hand awfully wide or use both hands to play a chord like this. But I want you to look what happens when you start playing in a key like F sharp. Look at these notes. Look at these notes. Look at these notes. Here's B. I mean, these chords are nightmarish, you know, and every one of them is duplicated in the key of C, and it's 1,000 times more simple. And that's why you're going to focus constantly on the key of C until you're extremely comfortable and confident of yourself. And then you can move on to, I would suggest the next key you might want to learn to play in is F, which it won't change the melody situation, but it'll change the chords because you'll have to add probably a half a dozen more chords if you're going to play in the key of F. The next choice would be G, and again, you'd have to add yet another half a dozen or more new chords to play in the key of G. And it's just more memorizing, and that's why the more you play in one key, and that key should be C because it's so simple, the more familiar you are, not only with how to play the chords, but what they sound like. So when you make a mistake, you know it instantly because you played this C major chord 100 times in the course of practicing, and a finger slips to the wrong note. maybe it's C, E, F sharp. You'll know it instantly because that's what playing by ear is all about. You can hear it and you immediately fix it. And I do that in the midst of performing. I make mistakes and I correct them almost instantly, not based on the treble clef or my memory, but based upon what I just heard. That's not what I wanted. That's the wrong chord. And it may be a terrible combination, or it may be just something that a lot of people can't even recognize because they don't go through what we're going through right now. So that's why I wanted to show you these nightmares. And that's why I keep emphasizing that you have to play in C, at least for openers, and probably for several years. You do not need to learn inversions, which I explained earlier. It's just a different order of the same notes of a chord. I call inversions are wants, they're not needs. As you progress, you will want to start doing inversions. You'll want to figure out how to play a chord inverted, because it adds, in the right moment, it adds a tremendous amount of, I guess I'd call it color. It's a wonderful tool for you to use, but you don't have to do it now. And frankly, you never have to do it, but if you're out to entertain people, you want to make it as pleasant as possible, and inversions can make a song sound better.